Hello and welcome everyone to the next DevSecOn Germany meetup today. With me is Sebastian, and before we do a quick intro, DevSecOn is brought to you by Sneak. We are an inclusive community that is all about enabling developers in application security. And we are a global community. We have 20 worldwide chapters, and we are leading the German one. And today with us, let me bring him on stage, is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how
welcome. Great to have you here. Before we jump in, a quick intro maybe from myself. I'm leading the DevSecOn Germany chapter together with Sebastian. I'm otherwise a solutions engineer at Sneak. Sebastian, quick word from you.
Yes, sure. Hi, I'm Seb. And I'm also a tech specialist at Sneak. Just to continue there, if you're watching this on YouTube, this is actually a great place to interact with our speakers during the session. So please drop your comments there, and Chris will address them after his talk. If you'd like to get in touch with the speaker, with Chris, with us afterwards, please join our Discord server. If you haven't signed up yet, you'll find the link on our website, devsecon.com, and look for the DSC-Germany channel. So please ask your questions afterwards as well. We will get them answered. Once the session is over, you'll be able to watch it again on our website, hopefully then share it with your friends and colleagues, or maybe both. Thank you.
Right, excellent. So, Chris, very happy to have you here. I know you're a great speaker. I've seen some of your talks before. The topic will be policy as version code, and I know you have an intro about yourself anyway, so I leave the stage to you, and I will now put the slides here, and the stage is all yours.
Cool, thanks both. Cheers. Well, hello, thank you very much for having me and for joining me here today. So, elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So bear with me a minute. So to set the scene, I'm in a lift, and yes, any American friends with us, we really do call them lifts. And 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close, I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I hear the door sill shut behind me, and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important. I gesture to her, see? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods, perfect, the CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what were the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? Well, she tells me lack of visibility and really can know what teams are doing. So the volume of risk and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing policy is often slow and hard to communicate. And people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better. And to be honest, often they do. But I'm then left playing catch up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, try not to sound like a patronizing snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, but looks slightly less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be a bit weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker, I say. Well, what's important to you? Well, managing risk, so mostly opportunity risk, the fear of missing out. So getting features out the door, avoiding getting bogged down with, as they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that seems almost designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Okay, how did you get in my imagination? I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person, hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. Well, what code do you write? I ask. It doesn't really matter. Python. Cool. Have you got everything updated to work with? As I pause, Python 3, I offer. They say, yeah, Python 3. Well, that must have been hard, I say. They don't know it yet, but I just won a bit of their trust, which is important. Nearly, they say. Cool. Okay, well, what's important to you? Staying on top of updating things so we can react to the next fire. knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, break, and ultimately what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debt, and fundamentally the rest of my team being able to cohesively work as one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Well, yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the usual remit. Great, I say, I write code too. So let's be friends. I hand them a printed QR code and say, here is my public GPG key. So you know that you can trust me. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and when it changes? Well, we get a memo or maybe something stuck to the notice board. Last week, we got a memo saying that all of the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. Well, how does that work out? Well, it's up to us then to maintain that glorified to-do list so we can onboard new people. Does that go wrong at all? Well, yeah, sometimes when we compile our operational manual wrong, we miss a memo or don't apply them in sequence, things fundamentally go wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I looked to the dev. Does it sound familiar or us? They nod. Okay, so it turns out we're not all special snowflakes, hey? Okay, so all's not lost. I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here today. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out the way to stop obstructing it, I answer, I don't actually work here. I'm here to fix the lift. People are complaining that it only goes to the top floor, no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs. The door shuts, and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of that might sound vaguely familiar, at least, and you can relate to my imaginary friends, then maybe I've got some answers for you. What if I said you could update policy easily, even releasing several updates to that, not just in a year, a month? What about 10 updates in a single day, and seamlessly communicate those to the people that need to consume it, all without derailing them? You could have visibility on compliance using perhaps tools that you already use. So that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to be, and fundamentally just not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter. So you can run compliance checks locally in CI and guard production ultimately. And that multiple versions of the policy, somewhat like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's some known vulnerability type updates are just a business as usual activity to communicate. It's interesting. Okay, so hang around. So I've hopefully at least got some of your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor for LearnK8s and Control Plane, consultant at the minute to the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, part of UK Gov, and a tinker of open source things. I've spent a fair chunk of my professional career now working in UK government and large organisations where problems like these are rife in the regulated space. I've been promised we'll have some time, plenty of time for questions, and of course your best heckles at the end, even if I run a bit over. So if not, you can find me on LinkedIn or the normal kind of things afterwards. Okay, so given that we've got the luxury of a live audience, but obviously not in person, so I can't ask you to raise your hands as I might do normally. We can at least try some audience participation and interaction. So if you could leave a comment, particularly if you're watching this on YouTube, if you could leave a comment of policy maker. So if you're with my CIO and have set, written, or applied any policy before in any shape, manner, or form. So that could be some linting styles on your code base that you're working with your team, or rules that you've defined in any sort, shape, manner, or form. I'll give you a second to do that. Okay, cool. So next round. So if you've ever sought, say, exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever, with maybe some at least good intentions, I mean, could you leave a comment of policy breaker? Okay, well, hopefully at least some of you have fallen for it. So thanks to the organising of Sneak and DevSecCon, we've got all of your names. We can track down all of your employer's details. So lend me your ears. The stakes just got raised. So where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I actually mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, so say something like data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, tabs being 2 or 4 space indentated maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which finds itself as the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come up against a situation that you weren't expecting. This actually is not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex to navigate rulebook and harder still to then measure compliance. This can often look like the thin bit of a wedge where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with others looking to expand upon its scope, which can lead us to sometimes wonder if that cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software, right? So why does this all have to be so hard? There must be a better answer. Well, we've codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we do it wrong. So maybe some of you out there are all screaming your favorite product name at me in your heads as the solution. And the thing is that you're not wholly wrong, but the devil is in the detail. Turns out throwing some curly braces or YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. Who knew? If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep the policy a secret. Exposing it could maybe be used against you by an adversary. However, that does not support us shifting left at all. It results in developers effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. Therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see that in a scenario of perhaps, say, an application deploy, midway through finding one resource is non-compliant and becomes rejected, would leave the overall deployment in an inconsistent halfway state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was the policy better than the downtime? Especially if this then leads your engineers, who are all hopefully smart people, at finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they've got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong. So you form that case law or scar tissue and need to apply a new policy. So now maybe all S3 buckets need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered breaking. Sure, you might say that you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policy, which is great so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted, say, GitOps or at least CI/CD, is anyone actually even seeing those warnings? And who amongst us actually studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest you're probably missing the point of CI/CD. You should be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not here today to just throw stones. Remember my implied promises to my 4 imaginary friends of what that promised land might look like. Well, there's nothing new under the sun here. We've already kind of unwittingly solved these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and then join the dots. Well, the first is something, if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already kind of doing and putting in place, which is put the thing in version control. The thing, however, you might not be doing is making that visible. So I'd be a strong proponent and advocate of at least inner sourcing it, by which I mean allow anyone within your walled garden of employees and suppliers and so on to see the policy. I'm not saying give away all your threat monitoring and intel away. You can probably keep all of that to yourself, but I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime, reverse engineered workarounds and opaque legacied exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks the ability to work well with prospective suppliers without cumbersome NDAs and whatnot. And widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now to those that need to see it. So many of you out there joining me today are familiar with semantic versioning, but a quick recap in context to this. So the first segment is used to indicate a breaking, perhaps conflicting changes in the context of policy. Let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. So maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging or something like that. Who knows? I'm not judging. And increments of that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than be free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes, that these shouldn't break anyone. And increments that might look like correcting a spelling mistake of one of those department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes. So these should be a no-brainer for everyone to keep up to date with. And increments that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository, it's versioned so we can easily communicate the policy, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are all being managed by Semver. Okay, so in software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? You might actually already unwittingly be doing this if, for example, you have ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps, or similar in others. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository, it's versioned, we can communicate the policy, we can tack on the release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. It's beginning to look a bit more like software, right? Okay, I know testing is a dirty word in this space, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend on and also provide some known good examples, tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface any potential side effects before they hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and then in CI/CD, thus shortening that feedback loop and better informing. So as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Okay, so we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like, say, GitHub's Dependable or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull request tests and even auto merging if you like. Okay, so to check everyone's still kind of with me and awake, could anyone leave a message in the chat and tell me what was a recent event that would cause people to know what version of a certain Java logging doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate. I'll give you a second to leave a comment. So yeah, as you know, all presentations for the last couple of years are contractually required to reference log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes. In some time in the future, I will hopefully be able to remove these and just broadly point at a scary looking list of CVEs in order to command your behavior through fear. But what I'm getting at here, though, is the situational awareness piece around supply chain is something that your organization is hopefully already thinking about, if not addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this at least is not a new problem. So software bill of the materials for the win, right? Which can allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing. And it's not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. It's time to look at how we might be able to do this. And I know you really came here wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! To maintain scope, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things to prove it's not just one tech or tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes. But I could have picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy, really, to invent much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick 2 tools. But again, I could have used any, some, or even all, probably. Chekhov, in this case, will be doing my Terraform, and Kaverne will be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization here. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code on screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to try and prove that I made a real thing. So the policy is stored in this repository on that org. So here's where my policy starts at version 1.0. I've got policy that requires a department label on all resources. So long as it's set, doesn't matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example about what good and bad looks like. We've pushed a tag in Git, we've added release notes, and I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which it does, obviously, but moving on. Version 2 looks similar, only now that department field has to be one of a predetermined list. Like before, test exists, release notes are written, tags are signed. 2.10 is where we notice and correct that spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of departments. 2.11, I've now added a new department to the list. A few more repositories in that org. So there's app1 and infra1. These depend on version 1.00 of the policy, and they're not compliant with version 2 or beyond. But how do you know that, you might ask? Well, I've configured Renovate to automatically make a pull request. When there's a new version of the policy, so it's super obvious if I can update my dependency and I can see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all of the pull requests over the org, so I can measure compliance of my policy. So moving on from that, there's a few more repositories, app2 and infra2. So these depend on version 2.00 of the policy. However, we could merge that open pull request all the way up to 2.11. Finally, app3 and infra3, well, they're dependent on 2.11 and they get a gold star from the CIO. There's a small touch of magic and it's not especially pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I probably definitely absolutely written a lot worse. What this does is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. So ideally, this might be a lot less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are very welcome to make this a bit more sane. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of that policy to be accepted and evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. So Kubernetes gives you admission controllers. It's not quite so easy to get that same policy evaluation in cloud. They've got their own policy kind of systems. I've not figured out yet how to be able to evaluate that same policy locally against the infra's code. Again, pull requests, contribution, collaboration, all very, very welcome in this space. So you may have noticed the way the policy I've written and designed, it lends itself well to be distributed and coexist with itself in a Kubernetes cluster, or coexist with versions of itself. Which brings us to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all of the versions that we've described so far. Likewise, cluster 2 only accepts version 2.00 or greater. We can automate all of this using kind for some CI in order to deploy the apps. And there we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant, policy, all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on. So this seems great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if that policy carried a story about why it exists in the first place? After all, if your agile delivery teams are even half effective, they will reject anything that they perceive as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. This could allow our devs to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy currently permits, they don't need any sort of kind of wordy exemption granted per se. They can have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions with risks that can then inform the mitigations manifested as policy, all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policies can then move with it. And when some new privacy regulation comes out, or your latest marketing strategy pays off and you acquire, say, some more data, for example, even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite for that will stand still for no one. We can liken this in some ways to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, change is hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it first time, which can lead us to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to risks that are more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is needed. And the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. So now this is all really over to you. Honestly, the best thing that any of you could do right now is tell me that this is madness, already done, irrelevant, or just otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber of peers have yet to do. So beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building building a case study with more willing organizations that will allow me to swap out more of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing that I'd like you to try and take away from our time together is that, and feel free to say this out loud with me, purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy, which I've been practicing saying far too many times. I've been Chris Nisbet-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. Free to leave. I'll work with the organisers to destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. Maybe. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, whatever. You can be rest assured there'll be no spam or much content at all. I'm pretty awful at self-promotion, especially on social media. CNS.me just points to my LinkedIn, and talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and they are all open source. Questions on this are very kind of welcome, or anything else. I'll be kind of hanging around in the comments section after the end of this broadcast, or ping me a message on LinkedIn too. Cool. I can see I've been rejoined by Matthias and Sebastian.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Great session, great talk. I guess some questions there. First of all, in the beginning, you said something about if policies are being opened, or some of them could be hidden. So do you have an example, like with policies that shouldn't be put openly?
I'm a big proponent in open source and publishing. That you can obviously kind of close some policy, but the point and the premise behind this largely is or at least putting forward the case that the benefits outweigh the risk. So the benefits that by exposing the policy and the rationale of why that policy actually exists, it results in the organization and the better patterns by the engineers and anyone consuming that policy. So if someone understands why the policy is defined and can see the detail of it, it's much easier to manage. Not unlike fundamentally the laws of the land, right? So you go speeding in your car. Well, if more people will speed inherently, if you've not put up a sign to say the thing. Now, you might put up a camera but no sign, and you can penalize them, right? And you can chastise the person that has gone over the limit. But that's not really encouraged the better kind of cultural systemic thing. It's a very crude kind of a thing that you can apply, but doesn't address the underpinning problems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it falls into the same discussion. Hey, is open source software more secure than proprietary software that is closed, right? And I think it's the same bucket there.
Yeah, very similar. And I mean, even if it's especially like the dynamics of that, but also then compounded within the org, and even closed source software, you will know roughly what the behavior of it is, right? It's deterministic and predictable, and you can explore it. You're less likely to creates organizational risks, but within the org that creates that, it's still kind of open with at least in a source within the to the team building it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Chris, what do you think about, say, coverage, right? So the policy examples you gave today was a bit about how to set certain fields, how to make sure the values are correct. But something that we observe quite often is that the things that are not covered or not caught by anything, those are the things that actually where things go a lot of times wrong.
Yeah, so turns out like things like the CIS benchmarks are also kind of versioned, right? And so it's possible to, if you want a shorthand, right, to pin and say version 1.0 of the company policy is going to require you to pass CIS benchmarks for whatever, with these exemptions to those where the org doesn't agree with them, whatever. Or these, we go with this version of Chekhov, which comes bundled with built-in policies of what they consider good practice, or anyone else, right? So yeah, like I'm not necessarily proposing that someone goes to the endeavors of writing an entirely kind of artisanal policy definition for their org from scratch. There are some shortcuts, but take them kind of consciously, and then when you poke holes in it, create a more meaningful reason to why it's exempt. So if it's like the S3 bucket being encrypted, for example, seems like a reasonably good idea, seems like it comes at near on zero cost. Yeah, cool, fine, tick the button. However, there may well be some causes where there's a good exemption for that. Like you want to use S3 as a really cheap CDN because you're lazy, whatever. In which case encryption less useful. So in that scenario, well, rather than saying this team has an exemption from that policy, or even that bucket has an exemption from the policy, it can be done on a more of an attribute level of, well, if it is a publicly facing thing, then it doesn't need encryption, right? As a thing, and we agree as an organization that that is acceptable, and then we can have a list easily of all of the things that are exempt. And if our risk position and appetite changes, which it will over time, you can reassess and see the landscape clearly and see where you have changes. So you might say your version 2 of the policy actually wants to amend that and actually says, no, we don't want to use S3 anymore. Well, fine, that thing is no longer compliant with the latest version of the policy. Was at a previous point in time, but then it's up to your org to then decide effectively the same way you do with software of, well, what is the support life cycle for a given version? So normally, like traditional worlds, like you manage like major version plus or minus 1, right? But whatever the organization wants to deal with and accept as the risk of the life cycles that they'll maintain, and kind of go, well, these are acceptable. So you've got kind of previous, your current world, and then future states, and any new stuff should be going on future states. Old stuff should be kind of going on stuff that you kind of finished building or is not in active development, and then anything current was what was the future a minute ago. So you can move it through that sort of life cycle, if that answers the question.
I think so. I mean, my takeaway is use some templates to get started with, inform the basic policy for the resources you care. Maybe just one more thing from a practicality standpoint, really, because we see also organizations with tons of technology that all should somehow fall under policy, right? So cloud providers, all the things we write software, deploy software, and of course, but then you very quickly run into like, the little VMware server running somewhere else. You run into like desktop computing, or you run into developer machines, things like that. Are you aware of a product, company, a system, maybe an approach to handle that all within a single policy that can be reviewed, maybe even given to an auditor when needed?
No, unfortunately. I mean, that's when you kind of start hitting probably the more sort of scale organization that would require, like if it's regulated, maybe it would require not just reaching for the shortcuts of going, well, we're going to depend on CIS. The reason for that is that I mean, you might use the policy from like any of the things that implement those benchmarks or whatever to like shortcut, like don't have to write all of the Rego or APA or Caverno or whatever the policy DSL is, domain specific language. So you might shortcut to that, but like the bit behind in terms of making that kind of platform effectively independent and agnostic is the principles, right? So if you go from a principle basis of start with the risk, right? So you've got a risk that leak some data or lose some data, or the data becomes corrupted. There are some consequences, spectrum from kind of risk to life type problems to you've got to pay for a load of insurance, for identity insurance, or whatever the impact is that the business perceives of the given risk. You don't make some sales, whatever there might be. Lose trust with your customers, which put a quantified number on. Whatever the thing might be, there is some risks and impact. Therefore, you've got some principles that stem from that, which are based on mitigations. So that might be, say, data at rest should be encrypted, or must be encrypted, probably better language. So that can be a principle, and then the how that is then manifested into the policy base is based on your technology, right? So applying that to, I don't know, say pick AWS, because I can talk to it reasonably well. To do that, you've got to say that the thing's encrypted depends on the technologies that you're then going to support in AWS. So if you know, like Dynamo S3 and EBS volumes, for example, the way that you articulate the thing, we want all of our data to be encrypted, is in at least 3 different bits of code, and depending how your teams are working, could be in more than that bits of software. So if you've got some people using CloudFormation, some people using Terraform and the CDK or anything else crazy to do their deploys, you may find yourself in a very diverse space of having to re-implement that same principle in multiple directions. But the principle is fundamentally the important thing to be versioned, and then it's implementation detail of how that applies to the actual things that you're going to, it affects. But no silver bullet, sorry.
Got it. Okay, nice. I mean, it's really good to know, right? So it is the scale out aspect is I think it's really important, especially given where you work. I would imagine you have not just a few places with policy.
Yeah. Well, it's not easy, and you can prioritize the important things, right? So pick the important things, that the 5-10 things that you want to make sure is definitely enforced everywhere, right? And then make sure that is well supported and prioritize the support for other stuff.
I mean, the term I heard there before was from a CISO level, like looking at the treasure map, right? Exactly what you said, the risk hotspots, and then see how we accommodate the risk, really.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Excellent. Yeah, we don't have any more questions in the chat. Chris, thank you very much for being here today. For any more questions, everybody can reach out to you. Also, of course, contribute to your repository, right? Any pull request or comment is welcome. Before we close, I just want to announce that our next DevSecCon Germany meetup is on the 17th of October, and it will be a deep dive into FICO. So it's all about real-time container security then. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for being here. Thank you, Seb, for co-hosting today. And I wish you all a great Thursday.
Cool. Thanks all. Cheers.
Bye.